All of us are aware of what's happening in Iran, but if you follow the mainstream media, you might find that you don't even know 10% of what's actually happening in Iran. Today, we're going to really understand what's happening in the country with Israeli American journalist Emily Schrader. Namaste, my name is Shreya Agarwal, advocate and journalist at Chuti Media, and I welcome you to our current affairs show. Namaste.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Namaste. Welcome. So the first thing that we want to know, Emily, is that who was Mahsa Amini and how's the phrase come up to become the go-to slogan for the Iranian Revolution?
So, Mahsa Amini is a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who was arrested by Iran's now infamous morality police for not wearing her hijab properly. She was actually wearing a hijab, but not wearing it properly. So that means like part of her hair, like from here, was showing, which is illegal in Iran. So they took her, I guess, abducted her, for lack of a better term, or arrested her, held her in a detainment center, and actually beat her to the point where she was comatose and then passed away from her injuries. Now, this isn't the first time the morality police have engaged in such activities against the women in Iran. It's not something new, but it was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. After the news broke of this young woman who was killed by the Iranian regime, the protests, I should say, started throughout the country, not just about the issue of hijab, but about the general Islamic regime and how they've been ruling the entire country. Now, that being said, there is a really important component here related to the mandatory hijab that has been in place since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. A few months ago as well, we saw a wave of uprisings with women-led uprising, removing their hijabs in protest of these oppressive laws that are on the books to this day until Iran. So that's the short background of Mahsa Amini.
Uh, Apart from this, what is the Iranian Revolution all about, and what progress have we made so far in terms of getting our rights back?
So I don't think that any formal progress has been made in terms of protecting rights of the Iranian people, unfortunately. And realistically, I don't think that's going to happen until this regime actually falls. There may be some lip service paid to small reforms here or there, depending on how this wave of protests ends, if it ends. But ultimately, the goal of these protests is a proper revolution. The Iranian people have been very united in their messaging across different ethnic and religious sectors, which is something that we haven't seen before in other protests on the ground in Iran, even since the Islamic Revolution. The people are really fed up and they're looking for a liberal, more secular government that will allow the people to be who they want to be, whether it's, secular or religious or anything else. And unfortunately, that's just not the reality on the ground in Iran today. And I don't think we're going to see major progress with that until this regime actually falls.
Right. Emily, so there's a lot going on around in the social media as well as the mainstream media about so many things about the Iranian Revolution. For instance, they say that the morality police has been disbanded. They say that nearly 14,000 people have been executed by the regime. They say that crackdowns on even people putting up posts on social media have happened. But how much of this is true? Can you throw some more light on that?
So I think anytime you have a controversial issue or conflict on social media, things get exaggerated or twisted or misreported, sometimes disreported, if you can say that intentionally. We know that the regime itself in Iran has been very, very active in spreading misinformation on social media on a consistent basis over the years, whether it be in bots or the cyber army that the regime has. They're very, very active and aware of the power of social media. which honestly is part of the reason that the Islamic regime has worked so hard to limit the access of the regular people in Iran to social media, which is another human rights violation. But when it comes to what is true and what is not true, we know so far that around 15,000 protesters have been arrested. We also know that the Iranian parliament did pass a resolution stating that they would, in theory, support the death penalty for up to 15,000, at the time, that's the number that were arrested. But that's not the same thing as sentencing all 15,000 to death. Now, from previous experience, we know that this is sort of the tactic of the Islamic regime. They have executed thousands en masse. They did it when the revolution happened. They've done it multiple times after with uprisings. So unfortunately, I don't think anyone in the world can be surprised that that may actually be what they're aiming for. That being said, it hasn't yet actually happened. What we do see is that this regime is executing multiple people, every few days, it seems like so far, who were arrested for protesting. Many times there are forced or falsified confessions from these protesters who have been arrested, especially the ones who have already been executed. So this is a very, very real threat, and it is a very real threat for thousands of people. That being said, it hasn't yet happened quite the way it was initially reported. When it comes to other issues such as the disbanding of the morality police, this was a complete fabrication. Personally, I think it was an intentional fabrication that came from the regime in order to sort of quell the complaints and the opposition, especially on social media, that's stemming from the West and from many people in the West who are calling out the Islamic regime, whether they be of Iranian background or not, for their human rights violations and violations against women's rights. That being said, it's not true. It's not the case. The story was initially leaked exclusively to Western media, mainstream sources, some of the leading sources in the United States, for example, which already tells you something suspicious about what these sources actually had in mind when it comes to it. It took several days even for those sources, which are normally fairly reliable on these issues, it took several days for them to actually issue a correction or retraction on these issues. But it was long enough that that rumor was already spreading to this day around the world. So we do need to be very careful about the information that we're receiving. Double, triple check, ask other sources that you do trust when these issues come up, because with the speed of how things are flowing and how rumors are going, it is important to double check the resources. However, if we're looking at history alone as an indicator for what's happening on the ground, and we do need to do that because Iran, as we know, has cut off the internet off and on throughout the country in different parts and different hours of the day. So the best thing that we can do is rely on what we know to be true in the past about the Islamic regime, which is precisely why I'm saying that, those 15,000 protesters who are arrested already are at risk of execution. And that is something very real and something that we should speak about, but we do need to be specific about how we phrase these things so that it doesn't become something that's inaccurate or untrue.
Correct. Speaking of, the protesters, the 14 or 15,000 protesters, do they include women and teenagers as well? Minors?
Yes, so I don't have the exact number of the minors today. There's a lot of different reports and information coming in, and we don't have access to everything that's happening with the regime in Iran. We do know that at least 500 protesters have already been killed, as in like being shot or targeted by the regime on the streets, like in the protests, not arrested and then executed. We also know that there are thousands of children, both, teenagers and in some cases even younger, as well as women, many, many, many women, because the initial protests, in fact, were spearheaded by women as it relates to, the morality police and these misogynistic laws that are on the books against women. So we know that all sectors of society, all religions, all genders, and unfortunately almost all ages have been arrested in these protests, in these uprisings against the regime. There are also several teenagers, teenage girls, students included, who were arrested after protests at their schools. In some cases, there were teenage girls who refused to sing songs praising IRGC commanders. They were arrested. In some cases, they were abducted in the middle of the night, kidnapped, and many of them were raped. or sexually assaulted. And in some cases, they've actually died as a result of some of those injuries. So what's happening is really shocking and horrific. And I think that anybody who's paying attention to what's going on with this regime should be disgusted and also extremely concerned about the future for the other protesters who are sitting in Iranian prisons today for the sole purpose of opposing this oppressive regime.
That's absolutely devastating, Emily. Do you also think that the mainstream media is softening up on its coverage of the revolution? And do you think are they bearing it all, or are they hiding things? Are they not? There's something really fishy with even the way the morality police being disbanded. That particular news just got out, leaked out, and it was all over the place. Uh,
Yeah, I mean,
despite being
I
false.
hesitate I hesitate to say that it's intentional. I don't think there's evidence that it's intentional. However, anytime you have a community that's, halfway around the world that doesn't understand the culture or the language or a lot of the history like you have in the West in its approach to Iran, you're gonna have a lot of inaccurate reporting about what's happening because they just don't understand the context, including at the level of, many senior journalists. So what's coming out about the revolution is often incomplete in the West. And you also have to consider the fact that the Iranian regime has been quite effective in pushing forward their talking points through particular figures in, for example, the United States. So in the United States, you have the Iranian lobbying group known as NIAC, NIAC. They're quite controversial, pretty much universally despised by the Iranian community, both Iranian American community and Iranians on the ground in Iran. But at the same time, many of their leaders or former leaders are very influential in the American government. And they've been very effective at meeting with American policymakers as well as American media and putting forward a very specific sort of sanitized narrative of what this regime is actually about, what they stand for, what they're seeking to do, what they're pursuing. And for, the most famous example would be how they presented the nuclear negotiations between the Islamic regime and the United States and European powers. It was a very pro-Iran approach to this conflict when at the end of the day, again, looking at history, you see very clearly that the Islamic regime simply can't be trusted with some of the capabilities that other countries might be able to be trusted with. Nobody wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And given the fact that they violated the existing Iran deal previously, and also that they are actively globally exporting terrorism, I mean, they've destabilized almost the entire Middle East in their bloodthirsty war against other Muslims, primarily against other Sunni Muslims. This is a huge part of the Islamic regime's agenda, and you can't count that out when you're talking about negotiating with the very same leaders who are carrying out acts of violence through Hezbollah or through the Houthis in Yemen or through other terrorist organizations in Iraq, in Syria, and other countries throughout the Middle East.
Right. Emily, in the broader sense, you've said in the past that the Western governments need to stop enabling the Islamic regime to survive. How exactly are they doing this?
So I think that the West has really failed so far on this revolution. And when I say that they have enabled the Islamic regime, obviously we're speaking about, sanction relief and even discussion of continuing nuclear agreements. There's no reason that any Western power should entertain the idea of having nuclear negotiations with a regime that is literally murdering and raping teenage girls in the streets of Iran. I mean, you wouldn't accept it from anyone else. So why would the United States government or any other government accept this from the Islamic regime? We're talking about a country that, was outraged by the hideous crimes of people like Jeffrey Epstein, and yet you have no problem negotiating with the Islamic regime? It's just outrageous, and it's super hypocritical. And, I've spoken about it at length, but the Biden administration particularly has been really weak on dealing with Iran, the Islamic regime in general, and both in terms of enforcement of existing sanctions, but also in terms of, talking about future negotiations over the nuclear deal. And in generally, they're giving them too much credit. They're giving the Iranian regime too much credit in what they say about their nuclear program. We already know that the regime has denied UN investigators from accessing their nuclear facilities. So there's no reason to trust them. And yet many Western governments, including the United States, keep wanting to trust them. When someone shows you who you are, believe them. This is something we've unfortunately learned very well in the state of Israel. And I think that Iran has demonstrated beyond any doubt who they really are when it comes to these issues, whether it's terrorism, whether it's civil rights violations, whether it's women's rights in their own country, or whether it's nuclear negotiations. So the United States and the West needs to be honest about what's actually happening. They need to say explicitly that we do not support the legitimacy of this regime because the people do not support the legitimacy of this regime. I think that the West would do everyone a favor if they said, not necessarily getting involved militarily, but if they said explicitly, yes, we hear the people's cry for change. We support regime change. President Biden saying something like that would make a huge difference. And unfortunately, we just haven't seen that from him or from other leaders. There have been a select few here or there, but we really need to see more support, both verbally and in terms of working with opposition groups to help them build a united opposition so that the day after this revolution, there is potential and a future that's bright, that's liberal, that's free for the people of Iran.
Then why do you think this is happening? Why is the West so hesitant to call out the atrocities of Islamic regimes across the world? It's not just Iran. It's everywhere. It's everywhere, right? It's Afghanistan as well. The Taliban is equally, it's going all out to violate women's rights, and yet you don't have the West speaking up. What's with this whole silence? What's with this chosen silence?
The first issue is that you have a history of very partisan conflicts within the United States where there's a reluctance and animosity towards wars like the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. So there's a reluctance to any sort of getting involved based on previous negative experiences, even going back to the Vietnam War. So already there's an issue within the public's perspective of these issues. On top of that, in the United States now, you have a very strong push from the progressive movement where there's a reluctance to criticize or to touch sensitive issues when it comes to religion. One of the issues in the Western media has been that people have complained that the Iranians, or that even showing footage of Iranian women removing hijab, is somehow Islamophobic. Despite the fact that that's not at all what the issue is or what the debate is over on the ground in Iran. It's a very Western-centric perspective to be coming from to even say that. And Mahsa, who's one of the major leaders of this movement, of this push in Iran against the Islamic regime, has written about this extensively, that she, based now in New York, has actually faced criticism and attacks from Western groups who are saying that she shouldn't be pushing back so fiercely against mandatory hijab. I think that people don't understand, having lived in the West, what it's like to not have a choice. In the West, we've always had a choice if we want to be religious or not religious, if we want to cover our hair or not cover our hair, no matter what the religion is. Judaism, Islam, Christianity, all of them have different standards, or different communities. They have different expectations for how women, and sometimes men as well, dress. But there's a choice in the United States. And in Iran, there isn't a choice. And not only that, but people are dying. People are being murdered for not wearing a hijab, or not even not wearing a hijab, but not wearing a hijab properly. This is unheard of in the United States. You often hear that, oh, well, women are persecuted for wearing hijab. This is not true. Find me an example of a woman who has been executed because she wore a hijab. It doesn't exist. Now, does that mean that there's not Islamophobia in some cases, and that women are not sometimes discriminated against or treated differently because they are religious, whatever their faith may be? That exists. Islamophobia does exist. But to put that on the same scale as women who are actually being beaten to death, like Mahsa Amini, for not wearing a hijab properly, it's insulting. It's insulting and it's intellectually dishonest. And I think that we have to have a real discussion, an educational discussion in the Western world about this issue, because it's not enough to simply say that, oh, well, we support women's rights, but what about the women who are persecuted because they do choose to wear hijab? That doesn't exist on the same scale. And comparing them is insulting to the other one, where the women are actually in physical danger because they choose not to, or because they remove a hijab, like the cases in Iran.
Precisely, and it's an insult to basic humanity, I would say. It's much more than it's not Islamophobic. It's not a matter of religion. It's a matter of humanity. If somebody weaker is, if a woman, if a child is being mistreated, being manhandled, physically assaulted, and if you're just turning your face away the other way, that's just inhuman in the first place. I mean, religion comes much later. Uh, Moving on, however, Emily, the revolution started off as something totally different, but it has metamorphosized into something else altogether. What areas of the Iranian people's daily lives is it touching now? In fact, they're also saying that power plants in Iran are switching to mazout as their primary fuel, and this is an indication of disruption in Iran's natural gas industry. Does the revolution have anything to do with this? And is the revolution affecting Iranian industrial works in any way?
So there have been widespread strikes periodically throughout this over 100 days now of protesting in Iran. Some of those strikes have included the sugar industry, the steel industry, the oil industry, a number of different industries that are, and natural gas as well, that are critical towards the regular functioning of the state of Iran. So this definitely has been impacted by the ongoing revolution. I think that it's one of the key factors, in fact, in actually bringing down this regime economically. I think initially, when the strikes in the gas industry started, the regime threatened to bring in Chinese workers to replace any workers who are on strike. And by the way, I just want to add that any of these workers in strike on the petroleum plants or in any of these industries, these key industries of Iran, are actually extremely brave, extremely, because the threat that they are facing and the risk that they're taking by striking at this time against the government is really beyond my ability to describe. They're really, really heroes for doing this. But again, it is impacted by the revolution, by what the goals of what this revolution are. I hope that it continues. I hope that they double down and that there are more industries and more factories that go on strike, including in some cases ones that are actually owned by the state. At least in one case, there was a natural gas facility that was owned by the state that was on strike. I don't know if they've been able to maintain that consistently on an ongoing basis, or if they were forced to work in some days. The Islamic regime has many ways of forcing citizens to do things. One of the things that they have exercised both within Iran and outside of Iran is threatening and arresting and torturing sometimes family members of Iranians. In one case, there was a woman, Iranian French woman based in Paris, who received a call from Iranian intelligence telling them that if she didn't stop posting on Instagram against the regime, that they would arrest her family and put them in Evin prison. So I would not be surprised if these are some of the same tactics that are being used to force workers to go back to work when it comes to strikes. That being said, I would encourage them, and anybody who has the ability to support them, I would encourage them to continue with these strikes. I do think it's critical towards actually making a change in Iran.
Are there no juvenile laws in Iran? Are there no laws protecting minors against execution?
I mean, of course, there are laws that exist, but the thing with Iran is that laws don't actually matter because everything is subject to the ruling, or the whims, should I say, of the Ayatollah. So when it comes to the so-called security of the Islamic regime, they don't operate on the basis of rule of law like many other countries do, both Western and non-Western. They operate on the basis of what the Islamic regime says is the law. So that could change tomorrow, and that could change, in 2 years. It doesn't really matter what's on the books. They can get away with whatever they want to get away with because they aren't a real government. They're a mafia. they're controlling the country like a mafia. Even people who are inside the regime don't support the regime, but they have to because their families and their livelihoods are being threatened. So I think, again, here we have a lack of understanding from much of the West in just how bad the situation is with the government in Iran. And I think that we also have a form of naivete when it comes to Afghanistan as well, when it comes to the Islamic, what are they calling themselves now? Emirates or something in Afghanistan, and their so-called, rule of law. It's the same thing. We're seeing the same thing. And I don't think it's in a way, it's beyond comprehension of your average person in the West, because the situation is so grave and so sinister that we don't really understand unless we have some sort of interaction or deeper level knowledge of what's happening on the ground and how these so-called governments actually operate.
So is the situation as bad in all Islamic all Islamic regimes, or is it specific to Iran?
I mean, I
Or
think
do
the
you think
situation
that there's a difference in how, say, yeah.
I think that the situation in Iran is significantly worse than any other country right now. And the primary reason for that is that Iran is a much more powerful country. They have more wealth, they have more natural resources, they have a previous history. I mean, they were an empire, historically speaking. So their influence globally is going to be much greater than some of the other countries that are facing similar issues, such as Afghanistan right now. So I can't speak to, every single country that defines itself that way. But when it comes to a country that's truly ruled exclusively by an Islamic theocracy, unfortunately, when it comes to what we saw with ISIS in Syria, and also, which wasn't a country, but it was, I guess, a region, and also the Taliban in Afghanistan, and also the Islamic regime, we see similar problems. We see similar human rights violations. We see similar approaches to women with deeply, deeply misogynistic and oppressive laws that prevent women from succeeding in any way. Just a few days ago, I saw that the Taliban had outlawed women visiting male doctors, which of course makes no sense because women are also not allowed to go to
Absolutely.
university. So no one can become a doctor that's female, and no one can see a doctor that's female, which means no health care for just over half the population. This is madness. This is madness. And it's so far into madness that it's difficult for many in the West to actually understand the extent of it and what a crisis situation these people are really facing, whether it's in Iran or in Afghanistan.
So we do have lessons to learn from there.
No, absolutely. I think there are lessons to learn. I think that
Um,
in any person in the Western world should really be educating themselves about what's happening and looking to have a deeper level understanding of how these leaders are operating and why it's so important that we continue to raise awareness about it and that we have a zero tolerance approach to these types of human rights violations. And we're seeing them for decades already. It's been over 40 years with the Islamic regime. Enough. This is enough. I think that the West, they don't need to go intervene militarily in everything that happens. I don't agree with that. However, there is a role to be played when it comes to fighting for the moral rights and the human rights of individuals. And I do think that the West has a role to play in, at the very least, speaking out against that and doing their best to sanction these regimes whenever and wherever possible, so that there is an actual change and that they see that when you get into power and you put these sort of gross human rights violations on, men, of course, but women and children in particular, it will not go unnoticed by the international community.
exactly. If you turn your face away from oppression, then you're siding with the oppressor. And,
Yes.
going back to the whole discussion and what you've taken us through, it seems as if I can't help but say this, but is the West in any position to lecture, say, India or some of the other South Asian countries about how they treat their women or about human rights, when the West refuses to speak up about blatant human rights violations, open, violations of child rights when it comes to Islamic regimes like Iran and Afghanistan. moving on, the last thing that I want you to address is that the British Airways recently, as a move to encourage diversity, has included the hijab in its uniform for those who'd like to wear them. What's your take on this move in light of the Iranian Revolution and the Mahsa Amini
I
movement?
mean, first of all, let me start by saying that any woman who chooses to wear a hijab or, a head covering of any kind, it also exists, in Judaism, sometimes in some sectors of Judaism, that's their right. And they are welcome to choose whatever is best for them. And it's not my place to judge that. Now, that being said, as I mentioned earlier, the reality is that you don't have women who are being murdered for for wearing a hijab or for wearing a head covering. Unfortunately, we do see in multiple places over the last few decades that women are being attacked, assaulted, arrested, beaten, in some cases murdered, honor killings for not wearing a hijab. And I think that as long as that's the case, we need to be careful about how we're promoting um, any kind of required dress that women are expected to have in certain communities. I don't think that just because a woman might choose that should be something that's banned. They should be allowed to do that, but at the same time, I don't think it's something that should be encouraged for any religion, because the reality of the situation is
Or endorsed?
exactly. The reality of the situation is that we've seen over and over again that the mandatory hijab and the laws in place that are specific to women about how they dress or how they act or what they wear, especially as it pertains to religion, all religions, this is something that goes hand in hand with human rights violations. And we can't ignore that fact, at least for now.
Absolutely, Emily. I thank you for taking time out to join us today and to take us through such a beautiful and such a brave discussion that you've taken us through. And I hope that we can connect again sometime soon. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.